So when we talk about distraction, here's another test that we ran here. It was an idea from Eugene Bleeker and Scott Brown. Scott says, hey, man, I'm doing this at Vanderbilt with these guys, and it's working, man. You need to test that. So I reached out to Emily, and that's what we did, and I'll let Emily talk about that.
All right, so like Lance said, we did another little experiment with the core velocity belt, and what we did is we had pitchers come in, and we did some high-speed motion capture with a series of pitches without the belt on, without any sort of distraction or any sort of external perturbation. And then they did a series of pitches with the belt on, and what we had was either Lance or Eugene were pulling the front hip open as they were pitching, and then we did a series of pitches that we tested after the belt, again without the belt on. And we compared the kinematic data from their pitches without the belt, before the belt, and then their pitches after the belt, just to see if a series of pulling their hip open would change and transfer into some different correlative data. So what we saw in general, big picture wise, after they had their series of pitches with the belt, was we saw that the pitchers were landing much more closed than they were previously. So we saw 8.6% longer to internally rotate at the back hip, so they're holding onto their back hip longer. Their pelvis deceleration pattern, that should actually say 11% less superior translation. So what we were looking at is as they were decelerating, before they went through their series of pitches where they were getting pulled open, a lot of the pitchers were transferring their pelvis up and over their femur of their landing leg. So the pelvis was translating in a superior direction instead of rotating around that fixed femur. But after their series of pitches with the belt on, we saw much more of that rotational movement at the pelvis as they were decelerating instead of that inferior to superior translation. Looking at the torso and the pelvis, we also saw increased speed at both the torso and the pelvis, 11.1% faster in their peak pelvis rotational velocity and about 12% faster in their peak torso rotational velocity. So this is a bunch of kinematic data. So we saw these changes. Basically, guys were delaying rotational opening a little bit and then moving faster. So it's one thing to measure things and look at what's changed and look at what's different, but this is all worthless data unless you know why. So in my opinion, when we look at these guys moving, we look at the video, when we had them being actively pulled with the core velocity belt open, what we were seeing is a slight moment of counter rotation at both the back hip and the torso. So the load or the external perturbation was being placed on their lead hip. So if it was a right-handed pitcher, the load was being placed on their left hip. And this isn't a load that's being placed on an open chain system. So an open chain is when you aren't anchored, so basically the foot is non-weight bearing. So as that foot is striding out is when the max load was being applied. It's really, really difficult to stabilize a proximal joint in an open chain position. So it's really difficult as a pitcher comes down the mound to stay closed and resist that force from the lead hip where the force is being applied. So instead, in my opinion, what's actually happening is that they're resisting that force at the back hip. So even though the force wasn't being applied to the back hip, it's being applied to the front hip, they're choosing to stabilize because they have to, because it's anchored, to stabilize that pelvis, that front hip, via the back hip. So what's happening is as that force is being applied to open them, instead of pulling open with that front hip in an open chain position, which is really difficult, the pitcher is actually stabilizing more effectively on that back hip, slightly internally rotating, so you're going to be activating your adductors and your glute max to stabilize that pelvis and hold that pelvis closed. And your body is really efficient, so it's going to use the muscles that have been activated. So if I have a moment of having increased muscular activation at my back hip, I'm going to be able to use that muscle more efficiently. It's like turning a light switch on. And the way our body works is that one glute doesn't really work without the other glute. There's a really close neurologic connection. There's a really close homunculus brain connection as well. So if my right glute is on, my left glute is on as well. So by stabilizing with the right glute, you've actually primed the system to stabilize with the left glute as well. So when I land, my left leg is already primed to work in a way that's muscularly more efficient and biomechanically more stable. And that's why I think we're actually seeing these changes with these guys, that they are delaying rotation, rotating more efficiently, and rotating more quickly because we've simply, like Lance was saying, created a problem that forced them to stabilize at the back leg that had these results.
And again, it's something that I wouldn't have thought of had it not been for Scott Brown and Eugene. I probably wouldn't have done that, but that's something that we've done, and it's just been cool. And again, it's just about trying new stuff, and it goes back to saying, hey, if you want to solve a problem, you need to create a problem.